All right, people, it's time to look at Canada and the Victorian area. Okay, so this will be the first chapter we're going to be looking at this semester in regards to new information and the creation of Canada. All right, so obviously this time period is named after Queen Victoria. Okay, the first thing we're going to be looking at immigrants, rich and poor. Okay, basically society, just like today, was broken up into different social standings: upper class, middle class, lower class. The higher up your standing, the more education, the more money, the more privilege, etc. You still have to understand during this time period, many of the new people that were coming to the colonies were very poor and were looking for a new way of starting things. Many of these people came from Ireland and Scotland to avoid the clearances and also the potato famine. All right, Native people and First Nations. These people had a huge change in the way they lived their lifestyles. Prior to the Europeans showing up, they had their own set ways of doing things. They had their own cultures, own identities. But once the Europeans started to come, many of their cultures and identities began to change. Their land was taken away from them. They were taken advantage of, abused, and lost much of their land to agreements that they thought were to share the land, but in fact, the Europeans were trying to take the land from them. Many of them changed their ways of living because of the fur trade and things like that. Okay, several mining companies were trying to get the go-ahead from the government, but it was deemed that the government would control mineral rights, things like that, on First Nations land, and also decide how and when this stuff was actually going to be happening. Many of the native bands became supported. They had to rent out their lands, their prime land on reservations, to Europeans, and the Europeans just basically never gave the land back. So much of the land that was put aside for First Nations people was actually taken away from them during this time period. Despite many measures to assimilate the people, the 150-year experiment failed miserably and is a direct result of many of the issues First Nations in Canada face today. All right. In 1837, as Queen Victoria came to her throne, her tastes, values, behaviors were what people based their lives on during this time period. There's many changes when it came to medicine, many leisure, things like that. But a lot of this stuff was still based on the attitude of Queen Victoria and the attitude of many of the people living during this time period, that Britain was more and more powerful, and also egos began to play a huge role during this time period as well. During this time period, as you can see, the British Commonwealth was all around the world. They had different colonies all over the place. They were also the main superpower during this time period. Okay, religion was important to many of the people during this time period. You had in most towns an Anglican church for the British people, Presbyterian for any Scottish people, Methodist and Catholic, and Catholic in particular to the Irish people. So there's different religions, but you have to understand the main religion, the main focus during this time period in many areas was Anglican, unless you're in Quebec or in an Irish area, and then it was Catholic. Leaders of the church still had heavy influence over the way people lived their lives, and they made the decisions when it came to education, schools, community matters, set standards, set the way people should live their lives, moral things, and that. Okay. Basically, they felt that it was a lottery to be born a British person because of the way Britain is, egotistical. They thought they were better than everybody, and when they came to new areas, they brought that attitude with them, and in fact had multiple run-ins with local people in areas as they were expanding around the world, and led to many conflicts. But because of their military strength, they were able to squash a lot of these different resistance groups and put their will upon those areas in which they took over. During this time period, fashion and decorations in houses became a huge thing. Women wore big long dresses that were very poofy. Men wore suits and top hats. No matter what class you were from, you're trying to emulate the styles of this time period. As you can see here, here's what a lot of women's dresses look like. As you can see, they're very long, very elaborate. As you can see here, men wore basically suits and ties. If you notice the hats, many of the hats that men were wearing this time period were made out of beaver pelts, which just happened to be Canada's #1 industry during this time period, fur trade. Okay, as you can see, some of the homes, they're big. They have lots of archways, fancy windows, things like that. The fancier a house looked, the more wealth you had. That was kind of the way. During this time period, it wasn't how many dollars and zeros were in your bank account. During this time period, signs of wealth were all material things: size of houses, decorations, the way your interior of your house was, things like that. As you can see here, here's an example of what some Victorian houses might have looked like. Okay, the next thing we're going to be looking at is science and medicine. Science and medicine had dramatic changes during this time period. During the Industrial Revolution, many new technologies, new ways of doing things became apparent. These two pictures here are a couple of pictures of people with smallpox, similar to chickenpox today. Okay. You have to understand, as new discoveries were constantly being done, people would take those new discoveries, look into them further, change things, become more advanced, right? It was basically a race to who could come up with better things. Newspapers and journals helped link the continents together in the spreading of these ideas, which allowed many new ideas from different parts of the world to be included, but also helped spread these ideas around the world to help people, whether it be for sanitation purposes, whether it be for different things like that. The ideas and discoveries that came out of this time period allowed people's lives to become better, cleaner, and they were less prone to diseases. Okay, people were trying to find cures for things such as cholera, smallpox, typhoid fever, influenza, tuberculosis, rheumatic, and scarlet fevers. During this time period, these diseases today are almost non-existent because of vaccinations and things like that. But during this time period, many children were dying because of these diseases, because they didn't understand what these diseases were or how to prevent them. Over time, vaccinations, things like that, were discovered, and many of these diseases today aren't too prevalent. They still exist in different parts of the world, but because of vaccinations, things like that, they're almost not seen in North America or Europe. Okay, many surgeons, early surgeons, infected their people because they didn't know to sterilize their equipment. Once they started realizing, hey, I just performed a surgery, but all these people are getting sick after I performed surgeries, they start to look into things. They realize bacteria and infections were being caused by the instruments. That's where sterilization came in. Louis Pasteur discovered basically organisms called the bacilli. He realizes that these are linked to many of the diseases that are out there. He discovered the cause of anthrax. Okay, so he comes up with many different forms of antiseptic that help people survive surgeries, but also help people not get sick from other diseases that were out there. Leisure and travel during this time period became more and more prevalent with the emergence of the middle class, the industrial society. More and more people were working set hours, set days of the week, things like that. So many people began to have more and more free time. And during this free time, people need to do something. So what happens? You start seeing development of different social gatherings and different social events. Okay. There's all kinds of concerts, fairs, circuses that would come to town and entertain people. When it came to within the smaller communities outside the major cities, they had what they called barn raising parties, which basically somebody needed a new barn. Everybody in the community would come out and help build the barn. They'd raise it up in a day, and then that evening they'd all have a party inside the place. Okay, books and magazines became popular. More and more people were able to read. As more and more people are able to read, ideas are being spread. People are coming up with new things. But the main thing is there's no internet, no television, no phones, no anything that we have today. So books and magazines were a form of entertainment that many people began to look into, and it created a culture that we still know today. Okay, leisure and travel, as you can see, there's a circus coming to town. There's also bare knuckle boxing. During this time period, it's almost a precursor to MMA. There were no real rules, and it was basically you could have 100 rounds, 2 or 3 minutes around, 100 rounds until somebody couldn't move or was incapacitated during this time period. Okay, so we had plenty of spectating sports like boxing. There was also all kinds of vicious animal sports out there as well that drew thousands of people. Now today in society, these would not be seen as being allowed or being very popular, but during this time period, you have to understand the way society was during this time period. These were perfectly acceptable. As society changes over time, many of these sports went to the wayside and are no longer seen as being viable options. Okay, medicine shows. Okay, you've all seen TV shows and movies where you have the guy that rolls into town, he's selling a tonic, a cure, for ailments, for hair loss, different things like that. These guys would come in and set up shop for a couple of days, sell their goods, promote their goods as tonics to help people with for almost anything. Okay, these medicine shows. Coca-Cola was a prime example of this. Coca-Cola was designed and originally sold as a headache medicine because the cocaine that was originally in it would help take away the headache for an extended period of time, but they did not last very long. Many of these people were just shady people who would go in and prey on the vulnerable people and get them to buy things that were basically just distilled water. Okay. Parlor games, things such as chess, checkers, darts, pool. These all became more and more prevalent during this time period as social gatherings, social ways of doing things, because more and more people could play the games. You could watch people play the game. You could become involved. So as things went on, these social gatherings became more and more prevalent. It wasn't just go home at the end of the working day and sleep in my place, get up in the morning, go work on the farm. People had more and more free time. They're looking for things to do, and this is where these social gatherings came in. Many clubs and organizations also began during this time period, such as the Freemasons, the Oddfellows clubs, things like that, as ways for people to do things. Okay, many different cultures, backgrounds influenced the way people did things as well during this time period. Many of the games that were developed during this time period would seem simplistic, or many of you would look at these acts and be like, what is going on here? But you have to understand, society, times, things like that, these are all perfectly acceptable. Okay, getting around, transportation changes things, right? The advent of the locomotive, the advent of steamships allowed people to go greater distances in shorter period of times. Tourism becomes a huge thing during this time period. People are going on vacations. They're going to pay to go to a different town to do things. So you have to understand this is allowing more and more people to access different parts of the world, also access different customs and things like that. And this is how ideas become more and more spread around the world. Okay, transportation. There were some early transportation links in Canada, some early trains, but they were only small tracks, 40, 50 kilometers in length, because they're a huge cost of building them and not enough population or demand for them. As Canada grows and grows and expands, we'll look at the expansion of the railways in Canada. Newspaper and communication, things like the telegraph, newspapers allowed information to get out there to people all over the different places, and it helped make this idea spread more and more quickly. People were able to find out what was going on in England within a couple of days of events going on there. Okay, also the telegraph, things like that. You have to understand during this time period, there's all kinds of newspapers out there, but you have to understand they were reporting the news, yes, but they were also reporting the news on their own viewpoints. There was no television during this time period, so everything was done by the news, and many people who had different beliefs politically, socially, stuff like that would buy certain newspapers that catered to the way they thought and the way they supported things. So news during this time period, you could read any number of different newspapers, but they're all going to tell the same story differently. They're going to have different slants, they're going to have different viewpoints, they're going to have different beliefs, things like that. Okay, many of the newspapers were used to report crimes, who was being arrested, put on trial, convicted, their names would be published, and they were used as a way to publicly shame people during this time period. Okay, today, due to different rights that people have in Canada and around the world, in many cases, you're not allowed to do this anymore, but during this time period, newspapers were used to publicly shame people that had been arrested, convicted, put on trial, things like that. There's also different recipe articles, self-help articles, fad science, many of the things you see in the newspapers today, except for things like comics and sports, they were generally not written about to the extent that they are today. Awesome. Thanks very much. And your questions will be posted later. And again, thanks for watching this, and I'll see you tomorrow.